The Scottish parliamentary elections were 2 weeks ago, and there's a dynamic from the results that you won't have read in any national newspaper. And that dynamic is how well candidates and parties who campaign on the platform of solidarity of trans rights did, and how badly parties who campaigned against trans rights did. Trans rights were not a top 10 issue for any of the large voter demographics, nor for any of the major party voter demographics. But there was a very clear trend of what happened to parties and candidates who voted for trans rights in the last parliament and those who voted against them. In the pro column, you had the Greens and the Lib Dems, who between them over doubled their seats coming into the new parliament, having set out manifesto platforms that were very solidly in favour of trans rights and running candidates who themselves also overwhelmingly were the people who pledged to ban conversion practices. Not only did they campaign on that platform, but they also put their money where their mouth is. The Greens elected 2 trans MSPs who have become the first trans parliamentarians in Scotland. Again, these parties over doubled their representation this election. In the middle, you have the SNP, whilst having a explicitly pro-trans platform, often disappointed LGBT people in the last parliament. They lost seats, but not nearly as many seats as many people expected they would. And then in the anti-column, you had Reform, who had a anti-trans platform, but it was mentioned once in their entire manifesto. It was not a primary issue for them. They performed well, but not as well as expected. And then you had Labour and the Tories who dedicated themselves wholeheartedly to transphobia in the last parliament, making it basically their primary issue, were annihilated in the elections, losing 2/3 of their parliamentarians. And the Labour Party, that ran on the most explicitly anti-trans manifesto Scotland has ever seen from a major party, significantly underperformed expectations and made this the every election since the Scottish Parliament was founded where they have lost seats on the previous election. The trends from this are clear. Trans rights are not a vote-losing issue. Meanwhile, fighting against trans rights might well be. We already saw this in previous elections. For example, Joanna Cherry, the most anti-trans rights parliamentarian in the SNP, suffering the largest election swing against her of any parliamentarian in Scotland in the 2024 election. In this election, parties and candidates who fought for trans rights overperformed, and parties and candidates who fought against trans rights underperformed. This is the opposite narrative you'll hear from most media, who are dedicated to the idea that trans rights are something that a majority of people oppose. It's not true. The majority of people don't care. But when it comes to people who do care, the number of people who support trans people and care a lot about supporting trans people dramatically outnumber the number of people who obsessively oppose trans rights. That transphobic core is actually a tiny proportion of the population, far smaller than the LGBTQ community. These elections should serve as a lesson to political parties that pandering to transphobia doesn't win votes, doesn't win elections, doesn't give them a political advantage. They will be rejected by people who believe in empathy and compassion towards trans people for their cruelty. Meanwhile, the number of people they'll gain for that cruelty is so small as to be electorally insignificant. Unfortunately, as those politicians and many of the journalists they listen to are hopelessly addicted to Twitter, a tiny microcosm of hatred on the internet, it is unlikely that we'll see them change course anytime soon. But fortunately, here in Scotland, we've elected a 2/3 majority of parties that, in their manifestos, pledge support to the trans community. So it doesn't actually matter if that small core of politicians who are left, well, after their colleagues were turfed out of office for their transphobia, continue to obsess about it. It doesn't actually matter if the media that they are obsessed with continue to report negatively on trans people, as more and more and more people turn their backs on hatred and cruelty. They have fought the most aggressive and obsessive campaign of hatred and discrimination over the last 5 years in Scotland that this country has seen in decades. And even after all that, they couldn't convince people to vote for them for it. They will either have to change or the public will leave them behind. But Scotland doesn't need to wait for them. The Scottish people have voted overwhelmingly in favour of trans rights, in favour of ban on conversion practices, so it's time for their representatives to deliver.